Boss battles are some of the most fun combat encounters to run in D&D. Nothing beats finishing off a really long dungeon or an expansive storyline than a brutal combat encounter that tests your players and maybe even earns them a level up. But getting bosses right in D&D can be tricky. I know I've run my fair share of bosses that end up falling flat rather than being the really exciting challenge that I hoped they would be. So you can avoid the same fate, here are some tips to help you plan better boss battles for your own campaign. Without further ado, let's get started. Let's start with the basics. Pretty much any boss that you run should have some combination of legendary actions, legendary resistances, and lair actions. In any fight between a single boss and a group of players, that party is going to have a huge advantage because they're just going to be able to do so many more things per round than your boss can. These are the tricks that your boss uses to help keep things fair and fight that imbalance. First are your legendary actions. Usually, a boss will get 3 legendary actions per round, and they can use them in between the turns of your players. After any other creature goes, they can use a legendary action to attack, or move around the battlefield, or try and hinder one of the heroes in some way. Without legendary action, your bosses are going to feel way more toothless. They're not going to be able to deal enough damage to keep up with the players, and just not be able to do enough things to keep the battle exciting and interesting as your players are going again and again and again and hindering your boss and attacking them in so many different ways. If legendary actions increase your boss's offense, then legendary resistances help bolster their defenses. A legendary resistance lets your boss automatically succeed on a saving throw if it fails. What this really does is make sure that your boss doesn't instantly get hit by some kind of save or suck effect. It would be super anticlimactic if on turn 1, the lich that your players are facing gets hit by a hold person spell and can't do anything, or is banished immediately from the battlefield, and that's it. Legendary resistances are what let your boss stick around and actually make it a battle, rather than just being stunned by the monk as soon as you all start out. That being said, they can't just do this over and over again. Most bosses have 3 legendary resistances, and once they burn through all of them, that's it. Your players have more than earned hitting them with some more punishing spells at that point. Legendary resistances also help make combat a little bit more tactical. Your players have to decide, do I want to just go and throw out my most powerful spell immediately, knowing that they might have a resistance that just lets them completely avoid the effects at all? Or should I wait, burn those resistances with lower level spells, and risk incurring the wrath of the boss? But eventually, once those resistances have been burned, if they're still alive, then they can hit more reliably with those big spells. It just makes the combat more interesting and in-depth for both you and the players when your boss has legendary resistances. Lastly, if your players make the mistake of fighting the boss on their home turf, then they can get lair actions. Starting on initiative count 20, after any players go that also rolled 20 on their initiative, your boss can activate their lair actions, born from the terrain itself to attack or hinder your players. For example, a red dragon might have the pools of lava in their lair begin to rise a little bit, singeing any players that are standing within 5 feet. Or an elder brain could cast a spell that creates a magical wall, a force field that blocks off part of the battlefield, making your players easier to target as they're split up. A lot of really powerful monsters will already have lair actions built into their stat blocks, but that doesn't mean that you can't add them to bosses that you're making up, or when you're taking smaller monsters in the monster manual and turning them into bosses. If you're having your players fight a really strong water elemental, for example, you could have them flood the chamber as a lair action, making it more difficult for the players to move around and attack. Now, you don't have to use all 3 of these things for every boss battle you run, especially when your players are a little bit weaker at lower levels. But throughout your campaign, legendary actions, legendary resistances, and lair actions are going to be your go-to whenever you're trying to plan challenging and more exciting boss battles. While those are all great tricks to help you balance one boss versus a bunch of players, the truth is your party's still probably going to hold the advantage. If you really want to balance out a combat, you should consider giving your boss minions. Think of the kobolds of a red dragon or the skeletons that follow a lich. Even a couple of minions can help completely change the dynamics of a battle. Even if they're doing just a tiny little bit of damage to your party, That could be the difference between a player getting off a heal or going down themselves and adding to the urgency of the fight. Your minions can also physically get between the party and the boss. So while the boss monster's sitting back striking your players from afar, they're going to have to get through all of these minions before they can even get to the one that they want to be attacking. It also stands to reason that any attack being sent at a skeleton is one less that's going toward the Skull Lord. So your boss is going to stick around a little bit longer as these minions absorb damage that should be going to them. I wouldn't go too crazy with minions. You don't want to bog down combat while you're rolling to attack with all of these different creatures. And you also don't want to completely overwhelm the party and just make things super unfair in the other direction. But adding in a couple of followers, just a few minions, can help make a fight even more challenging and fun for the players. In video games, some of the most fun bosses have stages. Just when you think you've finally taken out that tough enemy, it comes back for round 2 with more health and more abilities. In D&D, you can also plan stages for your bosses. Once your players deal a certain amount of damage, you can add extra health and extra actions to that boss. You can give it new ways to attack them or move around the battlefield to shift things up. You can also have the lair or the terrain around them change itself. Imagine if your players are fighting that red dragon, and after they're dealing more and more damage and starting to get low, it roars and all the pools of lava begin to burst and erupt. And now your players have to duck and dodge around geysers of magma as they're trying to fight it. You could also take a boss that before didn't have legendary actions and give it some once it gets to a certain amount of HP, maybe as it ascends to a new form. There are lots of ways to give your bosses different stages and lots of ways to keep that boss battle exciting as it goes on. Planning multiple stages is also a great way for you to hedge your bets in terms of the difficulty of your boss battle. Game design is really hard, and I know I've planned my fair share of boss battles that end up being way easier than I expected. If you have a second stage already planned in your notes, then as your players are fighting that boss, you can adjust the difficulty based on how well they're doing. If they are flat out destroying that boss, then you can throw that stage 2 at them and give them that extra challenge to fit the end of an arc or a long dungeon. Whereas if they're really struggling with just the first stage of the boss, you can always end it there and give your players the victory without needing that stage 2. Whether you use them or not, giving your bosses different stages is an awesome way to make them feel like a much more epic encounter than just the regular goons that your players are going to be fighting. Boss battles don't just have to be about health. You can add in other goals or obstacles for your players to face besides just getting that boss to 0 HP. For example, time is often one of the most powerful motivators. If your players know that in just a matter of rounds, something is going to explode and take out nearby buildings, or a portal will open up, allowing more enemies to rush in, well, now they're going to have to choose between fighting that boss or stopping whatever ticking time bomb is about to go off. You can also make the goal of the fight more than just kill this guy. For example, maybe they need to break into the boss's lair, not to destroy them, but to steal something from their collection. Now it becomes, how do you avoid this really powerful boss while still finding whatever treasure item you're after? Could also be more about survival than anything else. Maybe your players are trapped in a really tight spot and they need to hold out against this boss until allies and reinforcements can arrive to help fend them off. Lastly, one of the most tried and true motivators for your players is putting their friends, family, and the random NPC they fell in love with in session 2 in danger. If the boss has captured their loved ones and put them in some kind of predicament, well, now your players are going to have to decide, do we go after the boss and try and take them out, or do we save the ones we love? Bonus points if it comes down to letting the boss escape or saving a treasured family member. Adding in different goals and obstacles are going to make your boss battles even more interesting and less of just a slugfest to the death. Movement is critical in D&D, that your players and your bosses jockey around the battlefield to try and get the upper hand. But a lot of the time what ends up happening is your martial players run in, your bosses and them kind of wail on each other, nobody really wanting to move for fear of opportunity attacks, and your ranged players just sit in the back, peppering them with spells and arrows from afar. You want your bosses to be mobile, so they can get around the battlefield and threaten all of your players. If your boss has legendary actions, one thing I like to do is give them some kind of movement option that lets them get around in between your players' turns. Maybe a teleport for a devil, or a leap for some kind of hulking beast. If they're fighting a spellcaster, well, they can have access to spells like Misty Step or Dimension Door, or maybe even a magic item that gives them limited teleportation around the battlefield. You can also vary up what types of movement speeds your bosses are getting. If they have a burrow speed to go through rock or a fly speed to get in the air, that can completely change up the dynamics of the battle. The terrain of a monster's lair can also help it control the battlefield. You can bet that your bosses are going to want every advantage they can get over the players, and having the terrain suit their skills and abilities is one way they can do that. Slick ice inside of a white dragon's lair, or plants that grab and ensnare the players as they travel through a hag's forest. These are examples of how the terrain can be a hindrance for the players and can benefit the boss itself. Having your boss be mobile and in control of the battlefield will help keep your players on their toes and make it a difficult and engaging encounter, whether they're frontliners or hanging out in the back. All that said, your boss isn't always going to be able to move around at a moment's notice, so you want to make sure that they have both melee and ranged attack options. During the fight, you want your players to be thinking about things like taking cover, spacing out from one another, and how best they can avoid the boss's blows. But if it only has options to attack people that are right next to it, then your ranged players are never going to feel threatened. Giving your boss some more ranged options can be as simple as taking one of their existing attacks and just reflavoring it to be from afar. There's no reason that your general's sword attack couldn't also be a hand axe that they throw. Or if your players are fighting a powerful earth elemental, maybe it starts growing crystals out of its form and firing them like arrows across the battlefield. And in actuality, that's just a regular slam attack that you're changing up to be at range. You can also give your boss monsters area of effect attacks, like a dragon's breath weapon, that let them hit multiple enemies at once, even from across the battlefield. No matter how you do it, you want all of your players to feel threatened at all times, because you want them to stay engaged with the fight and what's happening on the battlefield, even if the boss isn't standing next to them at the moment. At the end of the day, bosses are meant to be beaten, and you're always trying to strike a balance between making it a challenge for your players without making it too hard to where they all die. And that means, occasionally, your bosses are going to get steamrolled. It's inevitable. Not every boss fight is going to be your best, especially when you're trying new things about giving them very legendary actions or making them more mobile on the battlefield. Sometimes your players just have a spell combo or a string of lucky rolls that let them completely take out the boss. Don't beat yourself up over bad boss battles. Learn from it and take what you've learned to make the boss battle even better next time. And in the future, you can laugh with your players about the time that they completely destroyed that frost giant you threw at them, or somehow crit that beholder 3 times in a row. It's D&D, the dice are crazy. These things happen, so don't let it get to you. Those are my tips for how to make better boss battles in your D&D games. Thank you so much for watching the video. I hope you got some tips here that you can apply to your own games. And just like everything in life, the more you practice it and the more you work at it, the better your boss battles are going to be. If you have your own tips that have helped you when planning these epic encounters in your games, or maybe some of the best boss monsters that you've thrown at your party, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video, maybe consider leaving a like or subscribing to the Bard's College. I make content about D&D and DMing, so if you like what you saw, that might be up your alley. But for now, good luck, and remember, crit your players.